The title of the show is Post-Noir, and it relates to an American art historical term, post-black. The idea of artists of African descent living in the United States who are deeply interested in questions of blackness, what it might mean now, what it has meant in the past, what it might mean in the future. And when I was thinking about that in relationship to debates in France about blackness, what that might mean here and how it's inflected in France by questions of Algeria or sub-Saharan Africa, immigration from other places, that the term black may encompass a different set of possibilities and people than the term black in the United States. The Double America is really me thinking about Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, and the very famous opening of that book. It says, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times, But I realized that in some ways what Dickens was talking about in that novel was not only the society that he was writing about, its past, but he was also talking about its present, And I was thinking about, America's the same place, because the first American neon I made, I think was in 2008. And it was at this moment when we were about to have, or we did have, I can't remember now, it's so long ago, black president, but we were in several wars at the same time. The economy was going well, but there's also high unemployment. And so how do those things happen at the same time? And so that sense of America being sort of at its height and at its bottom at the same time was what I was thinking about. And subsequently, because after Obama came Trump, I thought, it's always high and low. Those two things are kind of all what America's about. It's always the low flips above the high. So thinking about Double America was just a way of thinking about this idea of the same thing but seen differently, I was invited to do a residency in Canada at an art school, and they had a film production class. And I thought, it would be nice to make a film, but I want to make a film that is a recreation of the last minutes of Thomas Edison's version of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the novel. So I decided, there's a scene in the movie where Tom, the enslaved person who's the novel is named after, he's basically, it's his death scene. He's going to die. And so you see him kind of dying, and then as he's dying in the film, you see these visions of the future come up, like that Lincoln is going to free the enslaved people, that the North and South will rejoin, that the war will end, the Civil War. So I was going to make a film that was a recreation of that last scene of Edison's film. And it was going to be shot the same way that Thomas Edison had shot his film. Hand-cranked camera, 16 millimeter film. So we did that, and then when the film was developed, it was all out of focus. So we had 20 minutes of out of focus film. So that's how that film came about. But then it's also like a lot of my work, text taken to abstraction. So it starts as a realistic film and ends up as abstraction. It starts as a letter that you can read, and then it kind of falls apart. Starts as the word America, and then it gets flipped around. So a lot of my work has this operation in it, or this notion of like material that's taken towards a kind of abstraction, I think. If you think of a debris field as like what's left after an explosion, the kind of wreck of something, stuff lying around all over the place, broken. That's kind of how I was thinking about it in terms of thinking about, maybe I think when these paintings started about 4 or 5 years ago, politically what was happening in the United States was Trump. And so maybe I was thinking about that, suddenly our language has exploded. There's no such thing as facts anymore, or, the idea of truth is gone, So maybe subconsciously I was thinking about that. What happens when letters don't lose their ability to form words, a text, But I think also something opens up in that. These paintings, the debris field paintings, are much more compositionally driven for me. Because if you make a painting that has a text, you know how it's kind of gotta be. Start at the left, go across. That's how all my paintings start, Debris field is just like, kind of can start anywhere. So it was a different way of working for me, and much more improvisational, much more about composition, I think. I think there's always a level of legibility and illegibility in the painting. There's always goes back and forth between those two things in the text paintings that I do. The text is a quotation, so it's out in the world, You don't have to read it from my paintings. James Baldwin's Stranger in the Village exists in the world. But I think what I was always interested in is when a writer's writing something, they're struggling to make meaning. They're struggling to convey ideas. It's not easy. And that struggle, I think, was something I wanted to put into the paintings, but not necessarily thinking about the position of the writer, but thinking about the position of the viewer. That the viewer has to struggle with a painting, And that struggle with the painting is part of what those paintings are about. The idea that meaning doesn't just arrive. It has to be struggled for. You have to fight for it. You have to engage with the painting to get something out of it. In the same way that I had to think about Baldwin trying to make sense of, the world around him, and turn it into these beautiful gem-like essays that he wrote. So that's one thing. But also I think it's a sneaky way of, as I said before, of having content and making abstract paintings at the same time. So it's a text, specific text, and that text has a meaning, and it, references all sorts of things. But also I'm making abstract paintings and kind of pushing those two things together. A text of a painting is not the same as the text in a book. They do different things. They want to do different things. So the struggle to read the text is part of what those paintings are about. I had a residency at the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis, and it was, I think, for a year. And the idea was that I would have an exhibition there, but the exhibition would be based on work that I started in Minneapolis. And it could be any kind of work, really, any kind of artwork I wanted to make, but what they asked was that I worked with communities within a 3-mile circle around the building. I got very interested in these coloring books from the 1960s and 1970s. In America, there are debates in education in America at that time about how to teach Black history, because it wasn't being taught properly in the schools. So this group of Black educators come up with these coloring books that have, normal things coloring books have that you give to kids have in them, like somebody, playing basketball or somebody combing their hair, but also images of Black heroes, Malcolm X, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass. So it's the idea that if you show these images to young kids, they become normal, and that's a way to teach them about their own history. So when I took these 1970s, 60s, 70s coloring books and made sort of sheets and gave them to kids who were 3, 4, 5, and 6 years old, gave them these images to color. And then I made paintings based on the way the kids had colored in these images. And the work is about, I think, the difference between one historical moment and another. My notion of who Malcolm X is very different than a younger generation's notion of who Malcolm X is, and very different than a kid who knows nothing about Malcolm X and just thinks of it as a father figure to put lipstick on, And I told them a little bit about, who Malcolm X was, because they was like, oh, is that you? I was like, no, that's Malcolm X, and he was this person that lived a long time ago. They're 5-year-olds, they don't know these things. Anne's image was done in 1996, and it was in response to a march in Washington, D.C. the year before called the Million Man March. Well, I guess it had many organizing principles, but one of the things it was organized around was the visibility and presence of Black men in the United States. So when I was looking at images of the march, thinking about making a body of work using images of it, this is back in the day when we used Xerox machines. Nobody uses those anymore. So when I was blowing up this image of hands, it was like this big from a magazine, it just kept getting darker and darker and darker, and the sky behind became black. A lot of the faces disappeared, and I thought, oh, isn't it interesting that the act of making this thing bigger makes it less easy to read. Also because, the Million Man March, the subtitle of the march was the Day of Absence, and the idea was the people who didn't go to the march should stay home from work as a kind of silent protest. And I began thinking about that as the idea that why is it that Black Americans who were in the country before it was even America, who whose labor as enslaved people built the wealth of this country, why do we need to go to Washington every 10 or 20 years to assert our presence as part of the nation? Why do we keep doing that, you know? Or why do we have to do that? In 1968, there was a sanitation workers' strike in Memphis, Tennessee. Black sanitation workers doing the same job as their white counterparts, but paid half the amount. Same work. So they went out on strike, and they carried these signs that said, "I am a man." And this is the march that Martin Luther King went to support when he was assassinated. So I've been thinking about it for a long time, and then I finally made a painting that was based on one of these signs. I think that making artwork is a way of thinking, you know, for me. Which sometimes means you make bad artwork because you haven't thought through something very well. But also sometimes I think, someone said this to me once, and I think it's true, that sometimes art is something more than the artist, you know? That sometimes the artwork is somewhere else than where the artist is, and the artist will never catch up to the work itself. And maybe that's about the unconscious working, or maybe, you know, it's hard to say, but I kind of like that idea that artists aren't totally in control of what they make, you know. I mean, you're not in control of what you make because you put it in the world and other people do interpret it in ways that you haven't thought of. But I think deeper than that, the idea that you can't know everything about your work. So it's always a little bit extra. Yeah. Sometimes a lot extra. Yeah, so.